the 21st, was the feast of Saint Timothy. And today is an opportunity for us to look at the life and the ministry of Saint Timothy and see how he worked for the Holy Church, especially alongside St. Paul, and how he assisted St. Paul in everything that St. Paul did in his 30 or so years of ministry before, of course, he is martyred in Rome. And St. Timothy continues that ministry after the death of St. Paul. So we look into the early life of St. Timothy here as we begin. As we just read, we know that Timothy was born to a Gentile father, meaning someone who's an outsider from the Jewish community, and his mother was Jewish. And we actually read elsewhere, St. Paul, when he writes an epistle, a letter to Timothy, he mentions his mother, Timothy's mother, who's named Eunice, and also the grandmother of Timothy. And he calls them very devout. St. Paul refers to them as devout. And it's believed that they had begun to follow the ways of Christ, although they were Jewish by birth. They accepted the way, as it was called in the early church, the ways of Christ. And Timothy, as a result, also accepts Christ. And it's believed that he was probably born near the modern day city of Konya, also called Iconium in the ancient world. And again, he's born to a Gentile or Greek father, a non Jew, and a Jewish mother. And St. Paul engages in his public ministry. We know that we read about his conversion in Acts chapter 8, conversion, if you will, but he realizes that the God of the Old Testament, the God of Israel, the God of Israel who was present all throughout the Old Testament scripture, that is the God who took flesh. The Son of God took flesh as the second person of the Trinity. The Son of God, Jesus Christ, is God in the flesh. And once he realizes that, we know that he is emboldened by the Holy Spirit to go out and preach. And the rest of his life, the 30 or 35 years that are left in his life, are dedicated to Christ and his ministry. And this is a map of Paul's first missionary journey. We know that Paul always seemed to begin his missionary journeys from Antioch, Antioch being a major port city. That's also why, as we've talked about before, Antioch gained prominence in the Roman Empire. And then later that becomes a center of early Christianity. We know that after St. Stephen's death, many Christians travel north to Antioch. And it is from here that St. Paul goes on his first missionary journey. And actually, all of his missionary journeys begin at Antioch. And we can follow that route that he takes. He eventually goes around to this part. This part is called Galatia. He goes around and finally he comes to the town or city of Lystra. And this is where he encounters this Timothy, as we just read in Acts chapter 16, verses 1 through 6. And here, Timothy is interested in following Paul and Silas, who both have just been commissioned by the council in Jerusalem to go and preach to the Gentiles. So Timothy decides to join them. But as we just read in the passage that was read at the start, here we see that Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him. So he desires for Timothy to be with him because he's heard that this man is well respected and liked by the people of his town. But he says that Timothy has to be circumcised. And the reason for that is that according to the Jewish tradition, Jewish identity followed the mother's line. So, according to the Mosaic law, Timothy had to be circumcised because his mother is Jewish and therefore he is Jewish. Jewish identity, again, is matrilineal, at least in this period in the history of the Jewish community. So, because his mother is Jewish, he is technically a member of the Jewish community. And remember, the council in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 15, just one chapter before, decided if you're Jewish, then you are Jewish, and you can follow Christ after that. Or if you're Greek, then you don't need to be circumcised. So St. Paul realizes that in order to take Timothy with him on the rest of his journey and to have him with him, St. Paul needs to have Timothy circumcised. Because if he doesn't, then people will say, well, you're not following the law at all. And then St. Paul will be in a difficult situation. Later, we know that there's a big dispute because St. Paul says Titus, another one of his disciples, does not need to be circumcised. But Paul defends it, saying his mother is not Jewish. So he's technically not Jewish. I'm not going to ask him to be circumcised. In the case of Timothy, again, because his mother is Jewish and Jewish identity is matrilineal, it descends from the mother, Timothy is required by Paul to be circumcised. And what happens afterwards is that Timothy accompanies St. Paul throughout his missionary journeys, especially the second missionary journey. St. Paul's first missionary journey was around here, just in this area. But as we'll see, St. Paul's second missionary journey was much larger in scope. It covered much more land and more cities in the ancient world. And we see that here, St. Paul's second missionary journey. Here is a map of what his second missionary journey looked like. So again, he travels up from Jerusalem to Antioch. He goes by land this time, goes throughout Galatia, goes back to Lystra, where Timothy is from, goes through, this is another city called Antioch, but not the main one here. And he travels up to Philippi, where he meets the Philippians, the Thessalonians. He goes down to Athens. And there's even a point during this journey where people who are pagan think that Paul and Silas are gods, according to the Greek and Roman tradition, because they are performing miracles. But he tells them, no, no, I'm not a god like you are thinking. I'm sent by the true God. And he preaches Jesus Christ. But there's also another reason why St. Paul wanted to have Timothy circumcised before this journey. Because as St. Paul goes to each of these cities, he's going first to the synagogue, where the Jewish people are preaching and the Jewish people are learning the Old Testament, what we would call the Old Testament, what they would call the Mosaic Law, and the writings of the prophets, and the poetry that is present, and the history of Israel. And when he goes there, he doesn't want to have this Timothy with him, uncircumcised, and he doesn't want to be blamed for not following the law. So that's also another reason why Paul stresses and emphasizes that this must take place. But he takes Timothy along to all these different cities, and he relies on Timothy heavily throughout his ministry. Paul really relies on Timothy to be an aid, to be an assistant in this ministry in the Lord. And this is seen throughout the books of the New Testament, especially in the epistles that St. Paul writes. And we see a few instances where Timothy plays a crucial role. For example, there is one point where St. Paul sends Timothy to the church in Thessalonica while St. Paul is in Corinth. And he says, I want you to go there and see how they're doing. Because, as we just saw on the map, they first went to Thessalonica, and then they come down, go to Athens, and cross over into Corinth. So St. Paul is here in Corinth, and St. Paul sends Timothy back up to the place they came from and says to him, Timothy, I want you to see what's going on there. The gospel that we preached and taught to them, are they following it? St. Timothy goes to Thessalonica. He sees what's happening there. He comes back and reports it to St. Paul. And St. Paul is overjoyed because the church in Thessalonica, or Thessaloniki, if you will, in Greek, they're following the gospel. And he's very happy. He's not upset. He's not exasperated. He's not angry like he is when he writes the epistle to the Galatians. He says, "O foolish Galatians." Or when he writes to the Corinthians about what's happening there in terms of their disagreements. Paul is actually very happy to hear about what's happening in the church at Thessalonica. And he's able to know what's going on because he sent Timothy to go backwards, to go back to where they came from to report. So St. Timothy plays a role here. Again, another role that he plays. He travels to Macedonia, with another individual named Erastus to deliver Paul's message. Because Paul hears from the church in Jerusalem that they're really struggling. Financially, they're really struggling, and it's hard to maintain the ministry. So St. Paul sends Timothy to go to Macedonia and get them prepared because Paul's eventually going to come there and he's going to take a collection, a financial, a monetary collection to take money and send it to the church in Jerusalem. So St. Paul is relying on all these churches that he has established to give a monetary amount, money, finances, in order to send it back to the church in Jerusalem, because this is the mother church and they're struggling. And the one he entrusts with this responsibility to get everything prepared is Timothy. Again, Timothy travels to Corinth at a later time to convey Paul's message. He's oftentimes the carrier, the one who carries Paul's letters for him and gives it to different churches. Paul is the carrier, the one who delivers those epistles. What we see in the New Testament, as the letters written by St. Paul were often carried by Timothy, and he would often deliver that message either by word of mouth or as an actual written letter. And so St. Paul really depended on Timothy during his ministry. And like Paul, Timothy was also imprisoned many times throughout his ministry and his life. And there are even times when Paul is in prison and Timothy visits him, as we read in the book of Acts, and he's the one relaying messages and receiving messages for St. Paul while St. Paul is in prison. And there's multiple times, as we read in the book of Acts, where St. Paul is imprisoned. In fact, we know St. Paul writes a few letters, a few of his epistles are called the prison letters because he is writing these epistles to churches while he is imprisoned. And Timothy, again, is the one who delivers many of those letters. He relays information to those churches and he reports back to St. Paul. He does all of this out of a love for Christ. He does all of this because he believes that St. Paul is an apostle appointed by Christ to fulfill this ministry. And he understands that his role is as a helper. His role is to help St. Paul do all of these things. Can you just imagine how much ground Timothy has covered traveling with Paul and also traveling for Paul to these different places? And it's interesting because Timothy is doing this in a young age. We read in one of the epistles where Paul tells Timothy, do not let people look down upon you because you are young. Oftentimes, our youth, our younger ministries, we look to that verse as a sense of inspiration. It's talking about Timothy. It's talking to Timothy, that epistle. But that epistle that St. Paul writes, telling Timothy not to be worried because of his age and not let other people look down upon him because of his age, he's saying that because of what Timothy has done. Timothy has worked hard for the Holy Church. He's worked hard to fulfill the mission of Christ. And he's telling him, do not be discouraged. It's not like St. Paul is just telling him, hey, I know you're young, but don't be discouraged. He sees him working. He sees him working hard for the church and for Christ, and he's telling him, do not be discouraged. Ultimately, it comes to a time where Timothy is no longer just a messenger or just someone who is assisting. St. Paul realizes Timothy now has fully proven that he is a faithful servant of the Lord. And St. Paul entrusts upon Timothy a great ministry, and that is the role of a bishop. In the early church and in Greek, this title is episkopos. Episkopos is, in English, it would mean overseer, the one who oversees everything. And this is where we get episkopa or bishop from in our tradition. And he is believed to have been ordained by St. Paul in Ephesus. And the church in Ephesus is entrusted to Timothy in order for him to take care of, to be the shepherd. And Paul directs Timothy through his letters to govern the church, to administer the church, to stand up against false teachers and teachings, and also to ordain clergy in order to build up the church in Ephesus. In fact, we know that the pastoral letters that are written, two letters, First Timothy, Second Timothy, and the letter to Titus, are called pastoral letters because both Timothy and Titus were bishops, were episcopi or episcopos in two different cities. And this is important because they are serving as the leaders of the church in those specific cities where they were appointed by Paul and the greater church. And what we see here is that, again, Paul writes two letters to Timothy, First Timothy and Second Timothy. Second Timothy is actually written during Paul's final imprisonment, before he is eventually executed by the sword during the time of Emperor Nero in Rome in the mid 60s, in the year somewhere between 64 and 68 CE. And in these letters that Paul writes to Timothy, he teaches him how he must serve as a bishop, how he must serve the church as a member of the ordained clergy. And what's interesting is that in our church tradition, this letter or these letters, First Timothy and Second Timothy, that are written by Paul to Timothy, are referenced in our services. Because again, this is a blueprint. This is an instruction given to Timothy and Titus in that other epistle, the epistle to Titus. These are instructions given by St. Paul to both of these individuals in order to show them how to serve the Holy Church. And these letters are very important. And we even sing this in our services, both in the services of ordination, where a deacon or a priest or even a bishop is ordained, as well as for a priest or a bishop's funeral. These are also mentioned because in these letters, Paul instructs Timothy and Titus, this is how you should be as a bishop. This is how you should serve your flock. This is how you should administer the church. For example, in the service of ordination, specifically in a service of ordination of Mashamshona or deacon, full deacon, we sing the following. This is one of the hymns that we sing. Blessed Paul wrote to Timothy, his beloved disciple. O brother, consider and see how you must act for God's church. Do not impart the priesthood to the haughty or the brash, only those gentle and meek, for those who tend well their homes will serve the church steadfastly. So in this hymn, we clearly see what is written in the epistles to Timothy by St. Paul. He's telling him, do not give the priesthood, do not ordain people who are prideful or brash, rude. Ordain those who are gentle, those who are meek, those who are humble. And also, we know in the early church, bishops in the early church were married. Priests, of course, were married in that time. So he's saying those who can't take care of their homes, only those who take care of their homes well will be able to serve the church. Because as we know in our church, we call the home the house, the household, the little church. If you can't take care of the little church, how do you take care of the bigger church, the big church? And St. Paul is reminding Timothy of this, and this is why we sing this in an ordination service. In fact, for the ordination service, the candidate would read from the epistle written to Timothy to remind himself and for everyone to hear what is expected of him in terms of qualities and responsibilities when he is serving in the church as an ordained member. Dearly beloved, as we move forward in the life of Timothy, many decades pass after the death of St. Paul. Timothy continues his ministry in Ephesus. And eventually, in the year 97 CE, he reaches a martyr's end. He dies a martyr's death because he confronts a pagan mob who was worshiping Artemis or Diana, the Roman or the Greek goddess, goddess of the moon, goddess of hunting. And here, the city of Ephesus was a main center for the worship of this goddess. And Timothy opposes this. The mob gets very upset, angry, and they end up stoning him to death, and he receives a martyr's death. His body is left there after he is stoned to death, and his disciples take his body and bury him near the city on top of a mountain which is close by. And that is where Timothy is buried. Dearly beloved, because of everything that Timothy accomplished in his ministry, he's often referred to as Saint Timothy the Apostle, not because he knew Christ or because he was someone who was called by Christ like Simon Peter or Andrew or others, but because of his ministry. We very clearly saw how he went out, he preached, he taught, he served. He was willing to go anywhere that Paul asked him to go, and he remained faithful. And in that way, the church honors him as Saint Timothy the Apostle, again, as an honorary term to honor and respect and acknowledge his ministry. Here is a person who started serving Christ at a very young age. He wasn't discouraged by imprisonment. He wasn't discouraged when his mentor and teacher, St. Paul, was imprisoned and tortured. He didn't let hundreds of miles and travel get in the way of following Christ. And he is a person into his old age who remained faithful to Christ unto his very end. And that is why, even now, we remember him as a great apostle, a great preacher, a great bishop who shepherded and taught the faith in the time that he lived as a follower of Christ, as a follower of a disciple of St. Paul the Apostle, and also as the Bishop of Ephesus. May the intercession of St. Timothy be a strength for us. May his life, his determination, his ministry, and ultimately his martyrdom be a reminder to us of our own call to stay on track with our spiritual life, to stay committed, dedicated to our relationship with Christ no matter what happens, because Christ is the one who strengthens us, he's the one who equips us, he's the one who moves us forward. May God bless us all.